Welcome everyone to the virtual launch event of this program that's co-sponsored by the German Marshall Fund of the United States and Georgetown University Law Center's Center for Asian Law. And we're very happy to bring to the public the report and this introduction of it, of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the Future of the Belt and Road Initiative. We have the author of the report, Andrew Small, who is the Senior Transatlantic Fellow of the Asia Program of the German Marshall Fund for the United States. And commenting on this report after Andrew introduces it, we have Rabia Akhtar, who's the Director of the Center for Security, Strategy, and Policy Research at the University of Lahore in Pakistan, and she is joining us from there. And also Jonathan Hillman, who's the Senior Fellow in the Economics Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We're very glad to have their participation and the support of their institutions. And I also want to mention the great work that we've had in the experience of working together with the German Marshall Fund of the United States to bring this very important subject to greater attention. I'd also, in passing, like to thank the work of a couple of organizations at Georgetown Law Center. First of all, my executive director for the Center for Asian Law, Thomas Kellogg, who's done a lot of work in working with Andrew to bring this report to fruition in the editing and processing of it. It is available as of today, and it will be available online. I also want to mention the support of a couple of student organizations at Georgetown Law Center, the Asian Pacific American Law Students Association and the South Asian Law Students Association, who are, I believe, bringing many of their members to the Zoom meeting today. And I'm also very glad that we've been able, despite the pandemic, to bring this report to fruition, even though we have to do it in this virtual form. I believe it's going to be very important in informing foreign policy discussions going forward, especially in this election year. And we're very grateful to have had the support of the two institutions that are co-sponsoring, but also the institutions that our commentators belong to, and everyone who's come to join us from the various quarters of the world where we can now do this since we're all virtually meeting on Zoom. I realize that we're in various different time areas, and this may also affect the participation of some. We have a queue set up already for questions and answers, and we hope that more people will join that. And after Andrew presents his report for the first 10 to 15 minutes of the program, then we'll be turning to the commentators, Rabia first and then Jonathan. And then we hope to have a moderated discussion for the rest of the time period that we have between now and 11:15 a.m. Eastern Time. So I'm going to turn things over now to Andrew, and we'll listen to his recount of the report. And the report, as I mentioned, is available in full already on the website of the German Marshall Fund. And then we'll hear from Rabia and Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Jim. And I'd also like to begin just by thanking the Georgetown Center for Asian Law and Tom Kellogg in particular for the collaboration on this, and my fellow speakers, Rabia and John, whose book on the BRI will appear next week, and I'm sure will be excellent as well for being able to join this discussion. I just want to say a brief word about the way the report is set out. It's not really a standard analytical think tank paper of the sort that we normally do. I kept seeing a number of excellent CPEC reports that perfectly captured a moment in time, but were then eclipsed by the fluid political, economic, and strategic situation that brought things out in a different place only a few months later. So this report is, I think, for a think tank paper, unusually narrative heavy, really an account of how things have evolved and the factors affecting it, which I hope does mean that that it provides material that will still be useful whether or not you agree with all of the framing and the conclusions that I will be laying out these introductory remarks and that are there in the report, and whatever happens to CPEC in its next phase, because this is really a moving target, and remains so, and I think will be so even in the weeks and months ahead. This is also, as the report explains, an incredibly politically charged subject. And I'm well aware that anything written on this is often read by people against a series of indicators. Is it pro or anti-CPEC? Does it say that it's a debt trap? What is the real number? A whole series of other related questions that I think have often been obstacles to looking in a fairly straightforward way at what's happened, why, and what we can expect next. And I think that's essentially what this report tries to do, and what I will try to do as well, somewhat in these introductory comments. So there's two macro questions at issue. What does CPEC mean for the China-Pakistan relationship, which is one area that the report covers, and what does CPEC mean for the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, as a whole? I think CPEC was partly understood on the Chinese side as a vehicle for a broader reimagining, broadening, strengthening of the China-Pakistan relationship. From 2014 on, and all the more so after Xi Jinping's visit the following year, you don't just have the CPEC projects and what's happening there. You have a kind of a shift for a period of time in Pakistan's status for China too. The level of political attention that it receives, the bilateral traffic that takes place between the two sides, and even the language and rhetoric used on China's part. The talk among Chinese South Asian hands starts to emerge about a de-hyphenation strategy for Pakistan, much as the US had between India and Pakistan, but in this case with Pakistan as the kind of favored party. And you get in the wider strategic community in China, this discussion and kind of public statements about Pakistan being China's one true ally, and so on, language that China had not tended to use quite as openly before. And this was all supposed to be in certain ways facilitated by Pakistan to a certain extent learning lessons from the Chinese development experience and Chinese thinking about the economic basis of national power, and then replicating this. And I heard that very consistently from a number of interlocutors on the Chinese side during the early stages of CPEC. And CPEC was really supposed to be, they say, the vehicle for making a lot of this happen. But it was also supposed to be significant for the Belt and Road as a whole. It was understood on the Chinese side as a showcase for the BRI. The term that was adopted, the flagship, was something that came from the Chinese side. And success in Pakistan, which was the biggest cluster of BRI projects moving ahead at the fastest pace, at least in the early initial years, would not only be a kind of a proof of concept for the BRI as a new developmental model for countries, it would also show that the deep, close Pakistan-China relationship itself was something that other countries could look to as a model for the sort of benefits that accrued to China's friends. What happened in practice? I'll do a very short version that kind of speeds through the narrative of how a lot of this then played out. You had, first of all, the kind of full speed ahead version from 2015 to late 2017, when not only did you get about $19 billion worth of projects moving ahead on the ground, the inflated figures that one often heard and that one often still hears, $46 billion, $60 billion, even in some reckonings over $100 billion, did genuinely at that point represent the range of projects that were under consideration and in some cases under direct negotiation. These projects were not primarily about connecting Xinjiang to Baluchistan. Indeed, some Pakistani experts have said that really CPEC should never have been called a corridor at all, that the name itself it can often be misleading in terms of what the nature of the entire thing is. There are no pipelines or railway lines across the Kundrab Pass. They're still not in any of the plans that exist for CPEC. It was rather a staged process of investment packages. First, fix the energy and infrastructure situation, then build up key industries, and then move from there to a kind of broader-based economic cooperation between China and Pakistan, with Pakistan's status as an emerging market and heightened growth rates and things fully confirmed. What moved ahead quickly was the energy projects, which the government in power then, the PMLN, prioritized. The other internal infrastructure, the roads and so on, moved, but much more slowly. Gwadar and all of the associated projects around the port moved very slowly. And then the second phase plans for special economic zones, industrial cooperation, and so on moved at a glacial to almost non-existent pace during that first period of time. From late 2017, the economic numbers in Pakistan already started to be a concern for China. So by the time you got to the end of that year, you started to hear a lot more caution on China's part about financing new projects. And CPEC was already starting to run into a host of different obstacles for the industrial zones, in particular, payment issues that started to kick in on the energy projects, and various other internal political problems as well. And then as the tensions rose between the army and Nawaz Sharif, China basically decided to wait until after the elections before doing anything new on CPEC. So you had this kind of late 2017 punctuation point for the entire thing. And on China's part, they were very unhappy about what the army did to the PMLN, which they made clear. They had a strong preference for political continuity in Pakistan in order for CPEC to be pulled off. And that then got even worse after Imran Khan actually took office with a far more skeptical view of CPEC, which by all accounts was even more skeptical initially in private than anything that was expressed in public. You then, from the Chinese perspective, had this really quite disastrous period. As they saw it, they tried to be very accommodating to the new government, even though they thought that its agenda was a pretty poor fit for what CPEC is really supposed to be about. They were hit with a series of public interviews from ministers about putting CPEC on hold, and even on Xinjiang and the Uyghur situation at one point from the Religious Affairs Minister. You had a very disappointing visit to China from Imran Khan, in which he largely demanded aid and bailout money. You have Pakistani officials at certain points being hauled in for interviews over corruption issues around CPEC projects. And the net effect of all of this was that CPEC virtually ground to a halt in terms of anything new being generated. The old projects continued to be wrapped up, but there was nothing added to that on a serious scale that was moving ahead. And I think any sense of that original transformational agenda, CPEC as a developmental game changer for Pakistan, was largely dropped on China's part. I remember meeting one somewhat exasperated Chinese official a few months after the last elections in Pakistan, who went through this kind of scathing assessment of the new government and the various ministers, and then said with some exasperation, we can do peanut projects instead of mega projects if that's what they want. At this point, I think you had a picture with CPEC that matched a lot of what was going on with the BRI more generally. China had hoped that Pakistan would be different, given their special relationship. But in practice, a lot of the kind of discontent and problems and challenges it faced were similar to those that it was dealing with elsewhere along the BRI too. And so you started to get this kind of tapering back of the scale and the speed of the whole thing as a result. And I think in ordinary circumstances, that's pretty much what would have happened next and where things were moving. You would have had a sort of cooling down of CPEC starting to move a bit more slowly, finish up the projects that are there, make a couple of modest additions, and then move back to the kind of old security-centered focus to the China-Pakistan relationship that was and really remains China's real priority. But the narrative around CPEC has actually in many ways become almost as important as the projects themselves. Given its status as the BRI flagship, it needs to be seen to be moving ahead, it needs to be seen to be succeeding, and it certainly can't seem to be failing. Especially after last year, with the CPEC critique launched by the Trump administration, it's become yet another issue that has been subsumed in the wider Sino-US strategic contest in a way that it really wasn't, I think, in the initial years, which has invested the kind of public narrative and narrative battle around CPEC with even more political charge than it had before. So if we fast forward to this year, CPEC has been experiencing kind of a mini revival. Xi Jinping is due to make another visit in the not too distant future. We still don't know precisely when. And you have certainly, yes, a more modest version of the next phase of CPEC lining up, but one that is, I think, enough to sustain a story that things are kind of back on track. The army is running the new CPEC authority. We have the green light on a few special economic zones. There's a push underway to get the Gwadar projects wrapped up. We have a package of social aid projects that the new Chinese aid agency will run. You have one really big ticket item, the ML1 railway line, and a couple of new hydroelectric dams moving ahead. The pandemic itself has certainly affected things, but I think quite strikingly, despite the concerns about the effect on Pakistani government's financing, which have certainly not gone away, if anything, the geopolitical context and the need for new economic activity have actually given some additional momentum beyond what we saw at the beginning of 2020, even if the pandemic and the economic fallout certainly does mean that Pakistan, like so many other countries, is also embroiled in debt negotiations with China, including over some of the energy projects that were really the kind of centerpiece of the CPEC first phase. Where does that leave things? There are reasons relating to what's playing out now in the wider geostrategic context between China and India, between China and the United States, that mean that in many ways we're back to the kind of doubling down by Beijing on the China-Pakistan relationship again. But I think that's largely despite CPEC rather than because of it. It's the traditional security relationship with a modest economic overlay rather than the broad-based partnership that China originally intended. I think best encapsulated by the fact that the CPEC authority chief is a retired general, and that essentially any time a minister in the Pakistani government stepped out of line with their public comments about CPEC, the Chinese ambassador would call on GHQ, who would tell the minister to shut up. There has always been the question of whether CPEC would rebalance or reinforce existing power structures in Pakistan, and I think we now have an answer to that. From the perspective of the BRI, I think this has been a somewhat chastening experience for China. The elevated language about game changers, flagships, and so on has mostly gone, at least in private. And I don't believe that the Chinese side thinks that they're emerging with a kind of showcase in CPEC that other countries will want to replicate. I think China is also aware that it doesn't necessarily have the political wherewithal and reach to pull off these really transformative, large-scale developmental projects on the kind of CPEC kind of level, which is really what it was intended to be outside its own borders, even in a country whose government and whose public have been as traditionally friendly as Pakistan. Stepping away from the loftier goal, though, and judging it against some more modest metrics, this does still represent a significant increase in Chinese economic presence in Pakistan. It will be tens of billions of dollars of new projects. At the moment, probably around $25 billion of projects completed or in motion. One Chinese expert had a paper a couple of years back on the two sides' economic ties entitled "The China-Pakistan Economic Relationship, Tiny and Weak." It's not anymore. That has changed. Pakistan does not appear to be in unmanageable levels of CPEC-related debt either. That might have happened if it really was a $60 billion initiative, but it is a fair bit smaller than that. And that does have an impact on the debt trap question that people so often focus on. The Pakistani economy has obviously struggled in recent years, but that's largely not CPEC's fault, even if CPEC hasn't done a huge amount to help either. Which is why, in the end, I think the report kind of largely characterizes CPEC as so far a kind of tentative disappointment rather than a failure as such. I think it's a disappointment from which both sides are drawing lessons, and the kind of pared down version of CPEC that emerges will probably in some ways be more resilient than the maximalist version that was originally intended, assuming, of course, that we don't see some ill-judged choices of projects being made simply in order to keep this kind of CPEC success story alive. But I think it will be resilient largely because of a greater awareness of the limitations of what China can achieve in Pakistan and elsewhere, not because the difficulties that CPEC or the BRI faces have really been overcome. And I think as yet, there's still no sign of a BRI 2.0 or a CPEC 2.0 emerging that really does that. And I'll wrap up there.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think that's a very comprehensive overview of course, the much larger report that you've done, and I hope that all of the people participating today and many others will have a chance to see in full. And I think that we're fortunate to have two people who will make comments now on your report, who are well qualified by experience and also their positions to be able to illuminate some of the additional features that your report brings out, starting first with Rabia Akhtar, who, as I mentioned, is the director of the Center for Security, Strategy, and Policy Research at the University of Lahore, and speaks to us from the benefit of being currently in Pakistan. Rabia?
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the German Marshall Fund Asia and Georgetown University Center for Asia Law for inviting me to shed light on Andrew Small's comprehensive, interesting report on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. At a time when geoeconomics is challenging the preponderance of geopolitics, discussions and debates on connectivity initiatives like CPEC is all important. Without prejudice to the report, I must say at the very outset that CPEC, regardless of its scale, is a significant, transformative initiative for China and Pakistan and will undergird their relations for a considerable period of time. My talk today will both clarify and add to what the report lays bare. Let me start by looking at how both Pakistan and China are committed to making CPEC a success. I'm glad that the report acknowledges, to a degree, the need to keep CPEC on track. However, the extent to which Small portrays that CPEC is off track is a tad problematic for me. I see it differently. Let me break it down. What this report and other Western publications term pessimism, slowdown, and whatnot, I call that a combination of the 3 R's: recalibration, reassessment, and reassurance. What China and Pakistan are doing with CPEC is based on recalibration and reassessment that will ultimately lead to better, mutually beneficial outcomes and reassurance. 2 sovereign countries are expected to undergo all that you allude to in your report. While you call a watered-down version of CPEC as somewhat repugnant to its transformative and gargantuan nature, I find tailoring expectations and project designs in line with ground realities much more reassuring and sustainable. I ask you a question. Should 2 sovereign nations cobble up towards implementing workable, advantageous, and sustainable projects? Or should they, fearing international criticism, show inflexibility and go for lofty aims without taking into account the milieu on ground? I'm sure that most, if not all, will want countries to go for the former. China and Pakistan, as the report identifies, navigated challenges and impediments in a bid to keep CPEC on track. Let's face it, plans and goals change. Delays and deliberations happen. Let me give you an example. Did President Bush on the night of 6 October 2001 think that US forces would be bogged down in Afghanistan with no victory in sight for 19 years and counting? No. Nobody thought that the mighty US would consider withdrawal one day, leaving Afghanistan to handle its own affairs. Similarly, the managers of CPEC on both sides initially did not know what they were getting into, or that the tactical challenges would call for recalibration of their strategic goals. Notwithstanding the damaging effects of COVID-19, China and Pakistan did not back down from their vows to take CPEC to the next level. As a matter of fact, it is during the pandemic that CPEC has staged a comeback. For Andrew, the turnaround might be modest, but for me, the flurry of deals coupled with the accelerated developmental works in South Balochistan is emblematic of better things to come. I will dovetail this assertion with my critique of the author's refrain that gives the impression that Beijing has failed or is in for a disappointment. It is too premature to make such an assessment. That the pandemic didn't deter both countries from picking up the pace on the project is all but an indication of the fact that both are committed to expanding the scale of the project. The report indeed does a good job in outlining some of the political, strategic, and economic issues that have stifled CPEC. That said, the troubles are certainly surmountable. Let's look at the strategic factors first. Small makes a good point about the effects of the Washington-Beijing rivalry on CPEC and Pakistan's ability to walk a tightrope. However, Pakistan has been pretty clear on what it wants. In response to Washington's efforts to convince Islamabad about the grievous ramifications of CPEC, Pakistan has doubled down on not only expressing its support for China, but also vociferously highlighted how its economic future is tied to China. PM Khan has not shied away from defending China during his trips to the US. He also said, he told the US audience that while the US was wasting money in futile wars, China was developing infrastructure. Concomitantly, ties with the US have also improved, as evidenced by Washington-Islamabad cooperation and coordination over the Afghan peace process, and an excellent relationship that has developed between PM Khan and President Trump. In short, Pakistan does not want to get into a zero-sum game, and this is what Washington needs to understand. I would quote what Dr. Moeed Yusuf said in his recent talk. If country A launches 10 projects in our country, we'll be more than happy if country B launches 20. Also, both China and Pakistan have repeatedly said that CPEC is open to and for all. So China was even willing to change the name of the initiative to accommodate India, but India dished out threats and till date supports terrorist organizations that have targeted the Chinese and their interests in Balochistan and Sindh and want to resist CPEC by force. Coming to the political squabbling now, Small has indeed pinpointed the correct issues, especially those that were and probably are related to the change of guard in Pakistan. However, I don't necessarily see those pushbacks as detrimental to CPEC. As an academician and a citizen of Pakistan, I would be appreciative if my government is looking at making this project greener, less corruption prone, and more equitable. Papering over these issues in a bid to expedite CPEC might have won the government some brownie points, but might have also resulted in more costs and less benefits. If anything, this seemingly tough period has strengthened the scaffolds of cooperation between these two countries. Small has used an age-old lens to analyze civil-military relations related to CPEC. I think we need to broaden that prism. The CPEC authority was established to remove hindrances to the project's smooth progress. It is being headed by a civilian, mind you. The general, as you said, has retired. Institutional harmony is the key. This, in my view, demonstrates a solemn commitment by Pakistan to get the job done. After all, it is a national project. Disharmony is the last thing that Pakistan needs or can afford. Two reasons could have propelled the government to appoint a retired army man to head the CPEC authority. First is the pronounced security angle of CPEC. The project has to be secured from a number of internal and external threats which the military understands and continues to deal with. Second, the ability of the military to navigate bureaucratic hitches can come in handy in increasing the pace of the project. Islamabad's objective is to fast track the project's completion. And to my mind, this arrangement makes the achievement of the very aim possible. Andrew, you rightly pointed to the need for Pakistan to reform its economy, especially the power sector. As for reforms, Pakistan's PM Imran Khan has announced that new deals have been signed with IPPs to reduce costs and circular debt. More reforms are underway in the power sector. Though concerns raised over the prospects of the SEZs are somewhat valid, Pakistan has taken steps to leverage the SEZ's bonanza. The current government realizes the importance of SEZs. PM Khan, while performing the groundbreaking ceremony of SEZ in Faisalabad, said, and I quote, "There are many industries that wish to relocate from China. We had yet to provide them the environment for them to relocate to Pakistan. This special economic zone is that environment that China seeks." And I think Pakistan is cognizant of that environment that yet to be provided to China. The government has approved the construction of SEZs as it deems them important for the future of industrialization in the country. In this regard, the government has included 4 SEZs in its priority list. The focus on the SEZs has been complemented by efforts to improve the business and investment landscape in the country. So while pushing for doing business reforms, the government has established a project management unit at the Board of Investments in a bid to facilitate companies and SMEs interested in investing in those SEZs. The BOI's facilitation wing has been established to resolve issues faced by businesses. The idea behind reforms is to make it easier for businesses to invest in SEZs and elsewhere. The reforms revolve around introducing online registration, automation, etc. I would like to end my talk by saying that it is premature to write off CPEC or even its scale, or to say that Beijing is disappointed. As the report emphasizes, CPEC is invaluable to both countries. It is for the US to look at the potential for economic activity that this project brings with it. Analyzing it through a singular framework is both inaccurate and dangerous. The US needs to understand that CPEC and Pakistan are integral parts of China's Western horizon. I'd like to end here and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. I will give Andrew a chance to respond to both you and John after we've had John make his remarks, and before we open up the discussion generally to people who have already submitted questions on the Zoom Q&A. Jonathan?
Great, thank you. And congratulations to Andrew for producing, I think, what is the definitive report on CPEC, and not a surprise from the guy who wrote the book on China-Pakistan. So I think really quite an achievement there. And something that I really appreciate about how this was put together. Andrew mentioned this at the beginning. This takes a narrative historical approach to looking back at the last 7+ years, and I think that that's very important because you see an arc come out of that. And I think that arc tells us something important about not only CPEC, not only the Belt and Road, but about Chinese power. This was really, I think, supposed to be, a showcase for Chinese power, a flagship. As Andrew mentioned, that's not a term that someone foisted upon the Chinese side. They decided to call this the flagship dimension of Belt and Road. And it began with, I think, pretty sky-high expectations. And so in retrospect, it's almost inevitable that we have, recalibrated, but it is worth walking through how that happened. And I think that arc, from very high expectations to dealing with messy realities on the ground, to recalibrating and looking forward to sort of a smaller project pipeline, that to me is very, it has several striking parallels with past efforts, foreign efforts in Pakistan, especially the US experience. And so this is something that my book, The Emperor's New Road, touches on, but I think it's really quite striking. You had, in the late early 50s through the 60s, a lot of engagement from US economists in particular, who at the time, I think, really felt the wind at their backs. They, had been, succeeding in helping to rebuild Western Europe, right? This is a story that the German Marshall Fund knows quite well. And they felt, I think, that their toolkit was almost universal. They like Keynesian economics was going to work anywhere, under any conditions. And so they went in, to advise countries, Pakistan being one of them, on economic planning, I think with very sky-high expectations. And then learned, over the course of many years that development is not the same thing as rebuilding economies that were once developed. It's much more difficult. And I think there was, that was a humbling experience. And, for the US, really put in a considerable amount of money and assistance, technical assistance, including supporting infrastructure projects over the decades, as does the World Bank and other multilateral institutions. All of that, I think, provides this body of experience that can be used almost as a ruler to kind of compare China's, a yardstick to measure China's approach in Pakistan and what it tells us about Chinese power. And I think in many cases, rather than charting a new course, China has repeated some of the same mistakes that its predecessors made. And so again, I think it's been a humbling experience. In some cases, the parallels are so striking to include similar projects. Gwadar Port, which obviously predates the Belt and Road and CPEC, was once offered to President Richard Nixon. And this is a story that I retell in this book. And the project was evaluated by the U.S. National Security Council, then led under Henry Kissinger. And the concerns were that this was going to be a project that was mainly driven to support domestic political agenda, that it would be difficult to operationalize and have it, be really economically successful. And so it had this, they literally said, we were worried this is a white elephant project and it could anger others in the region. And I think many of those things have actually occurred. The port, despite being really where, the overland and maritime part of CPEC is meeting, still has really serious challenges and has not become a showpiece in the same way that some other Belt and Road projects have, the port in Piraeus, Greece being one of them. Chinese officials will take foreign officials to Piraeus and show them, to kind of get them to imagine this is what could happen if you partner with us. Guadar is not that showcase yet. And so I think, the US, despite having passed on it decades ago, China went ahead with it. And I may or may not regret that right now. I think that there probably is regret in making this the flagship dimension of the Belt and Road. But at the same time, you see learning occurring, right? And so I think this is not a story of outright failure. It's not a story, certainly not a story of China imposing its will and dominating a foreign country. This is, I think, if anything, a story about the education of a rising power, following in the footsteps of others, in some cases repeating their mistakes, in some cases learning. Andrew makes a compelling point in this report that I think one of the lessons that maybe was not learned correctly is that, really the civilian institution should have been strengthened and worked with rather than relying so heavily on the military in Pakistan. But you can see in sort of the statements that are released about CPEC from both sides, in a project pipeline that has been adjusted, that this has now been scaled down to something that should be more sustainable. And so, again, this to me, there's a feedback loop that's happening here, and the evidence that this will continue beyond the pandemic, I think, is strong. So I want to leave plenty of time to discuss this. I thought Rabia made some really interesting points, and I want to give Andrew a chance as well to get in here. So thanks.
Thank you, John. And I will turn it back to Andrew now to reflect on the comments he's just heard from Rabia and John, and then we'll open it up for the comments that have already become quite numerous from our audience.
I'll only say a couple of very brief things. Thanks, Rabia, and thanks, John, very much for your thoughts and comments on that. I'll just kind of make one kind of macro response to Rabia on kind of the central thrust of her kind of analysis, and then I think there are lots of interesting questions that that everyone can kind of jump in on as well. I don't necessarily, I think, disagree with almost anything that Rabia said in terms of the analysis of what's going on, maybe bar 2 points, which I think do remain to be seen. Whether this does end up being transformative, I think, remains to be seen. I think whether it is a disappointment in the fullness of time for the Chinese side remains to be seen. I am very well aware from interlocutors on the Chinese side what the assessment has been at different intervals on this. And I don't disagree with the view that the pushback that was experienced and what was represented by the PTI coming to power and by voices in the army on some of these things as well, frankly, in terms of a set of the concerns about the first phase, were genuine concerns that needed to be wrestled with. The unhappiness on China's part came about because there was kind of real pushback in various areas, which is healthy. I think a lot of this played out behind closed doors. One of the reasons that kind of did the report was to kind of tease a lot more of this out in public. I still think a remarkable amount of this has been sort of somewhat buried, but there were very significant internal debates about these questions that were, I think, important in terms of being able to get CPEC on some kind of a sounder footing as a result of the kind of wrestling over these things that took place. It wasn't necessarily the best trajectory if it continued as originally intended. It wasn't necessarily the best trajectory, and I think one of the questions that's come in on this is it wasn't necessarily the best thing if it did end up being 60 billion, kind of the sort of scale that was originally envisaged. I think the recalibration, reassessment elements of it made a lot of sense. And as I kind of said in the opening remarks, I think it will be more resilient probably as a result of that. We still don't know what's exactly where the other that the Chinese side particularly doesn't like, which is the renegotiation term, actually comes out on some of the existing projects. That remains to be seen, and whether some of the political obstacles and things that we've seen for the special economic zones and the disquiet from Pakistani business that resulted in these things being slowed down, I think also remains to be seen. My concern is still that rather than moving to this kind of much broader based level of engagement and kind of figuring this out in the way that you somewhat outlined, Rabia, kind of what would sound like a deeper level of engagement across the country, instead ends up being kind of re-centralized to the top again. And that's what, to a certain extent, I feel I've seen it. If it had been that kind of deep engagement with the new government and things, then we might be coming out in a slightly different place. I think we're not yet sure whether, and indications at the moment are that China kind of retreats and tries to kind of manage it in the old way, rather than kind of, as it were, leaning into the discomfort of dealing with a wider array of Pakistani business, civil society, opposition groups, and all of these sorts of things. So I agree, finally, before we go into the questions, that it is too premature to make a definitive assessment, and that's why the report was kind of written as it was. I hope that by laying out the narrative, I think we may, if we take stock again in a year's time, we may be in a very different place with all of this. I think we'll be in a very different position to assess it, even by the time that Xi Jinping visits, in terms of the grand scheme of these things. But again, I don't necessarily think these things should be seen as kind of good or bad necessarily. What I mean, I think it's just to try and pull out what is it that has actually played out on this. A rebalancing and a reassessment can be positive. I think on the Chinese side, there's been a huge aversion to talking about it in these terms. There's been a real concern that it's kind of, lots of these things are again kind of kept quite quiet and contained. And I think it would actually be more helpful if we can have these kind of fairly frank accounts and debates about what's really played out with it and what we might expect. And I'll kind of wrap up my response there.
Thank you, Andrew. I probably should give Rabia and John another minute or two if they want to say anything in response to that, but then I'd really like to open it up to the numerous questioners we have in queue.
So thank you, Andrew, for taking my comments in the spirit that they were made. I enjoyed reading the report, but my overall sense was not that of disappointment now that we see it happening. I know initially the enthusiasm with which China signed the deal with the PMLN government, it happened because they had no idea, there was no feasibility study done of the tactical challenges and how China was going to be bogged down, not only at the federal level, at the provincial level, but also at the local government level. And once that dawned, then, I think there was a sit back and thinking, oh my God, what have we landed ourselves into? Because it has been entirely unprecedented, right, in China-Pakistan relations. So I think there's a lot of learning that has happened. And 2 years in, this government has, again, you've added so many R's to my 3 R's. So recalibration, reassessment, resilience, reassurance, renegotiation. So now we have 5 hours. So, so let's see as to how things roll. And you're very right. Probably if you were to do a 2.0 on this report in a year's time, probably your assessments would be more cheerful. So thank you.
Just one quick comment. I do think it's interesting, and this is something that's, I think, true across sort of reactions about CPEC. It's often, I think people are reacting sometimes, you know, when they sort of suggest whether this has succeeded or failed or something else. You know, it really depends on what were your expectations going into this, and I think some of this reveals that people had very different expectations. Another, I think, important part of this experience for sort of Belt and Road more broadly is that it is interesting that, I mean, if you could say that the 60-ish, 62 billion-ish numbers were always fantasy, but they stuck enough, and we've ended up, as Andrew points out, with something closer to 25. And to be able to call that a success, I think there's something very interesting about that, because one of the biggest challenges I think many Belt and Road or many countries participating in the Belt and Road are canceling projects. So how do you know, because this is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy vision, even during the pandemic, you have Chinese officials saying, no large projects have been canceled. So there's this huge political barrier to doing that, which I think is something that needs to be dealt with in order to make these efforts more sustainable. So there might be lessons here from Pakistan's experience. How do you get from 62 to 25 with a smile on your face, and, you know, keep a sort of positive message about this?
Thank you, Rabia and John. I'd now like to turn to the questions that we've gotten from the audience, and there are numerous. I don't think we'll get through all of them, but I'll try and take some that reflect a range of questions that we've gotten from several of the people in this program. The first, actually, that came even before the program started, and it seems like something that definitely is worth addressing. How is India a variable in the evolving CPEC scenario? How does Indian opposition and future reactions or behavior with regard to both CPEC and the Belt and Road Initiative figure in the China-Pakistan calculus?
Okay, I'll make a couple of comments on that. The interesting thing about CPEC in the initial stages was that there did genuinely seem to be a belief on China's part that they would be able to persuade India that CPEC was sort of potentially beneficial, or that it was at least a kind of non-hostile part of the relationship. Li Keqiang had this kind of quote to Modi in which he talked about weaning the populace from fundamentalism. Whether the sort of rendering is accurate, the fact I think is there that the pitch was that economic stabilization of Pakistan was something that was potentially beneficial and at least should be viewed neutrally on India's side. I don't think realistically it was going to be seen positively, but that at least this could be seen as the part of the China-Pakistan relationship that was not kind of directed in a militarily hostile way against India. And that as a result of this is where the kind of decoupling stuff came from, that it would be possible to kind of deepen and expand the China-Pakistan relationship on the economic side without eliciting certain sorts of reactions from India. And it became, I think, very quickly clear that that was misplaced as an assessment on China's part. India's assessment, I think, fairly uniformly was that it was the best way of understanding what was going to happen in the future of the China-Pakistan relationship was what had happened in the past, that this wasn't different. This was going to be subsumed within the kind of traditional security military calculus that was there already, would reinforce existing tendencies and all of these sorts of things. And I think in some ways this is, I mean, there is the Kashmir question of course in this, and roots, which again I think were some of the slightly unhelpful thing about the concept of the corridor, and China actually was at some points treading quite carefully about projects in Gilgit-Baltistan as a result of that, certainly in terms of the scale of what was envisaged. And you also had, I think, which did play in a little bit to a slight leaning back on the Chinese side after after the Doklam conflict and the kind of attempts to stabilize the China-India relationship that followed from that, there were kind of a few moves. I think China did start to see that there were certain things in the relationship with Pakistan that it may have to kind of start negotiating on slightly different terms with India again, particularly with respect to FATF and a couple of other areas. But to a certain extent, CPEC kind of lurked in the background as well. It was treated with a bit more trepidation. I think given what's now happening on the China-India front, of course, a lot of that's gone away. And actually, there are fewer inhibitions, I think, about some of the projects, including the new dams in Kashmir and some of these things, than I think were even present before. And I think that's going to be more characteristic of how it's viewed. I think we will again be there'll be less sensitivity to some of India's concerns about some of these things, given the trajectory that I think things are now headed in. But not just the Chinese side does not place as much stress as the Pakistani side does on some of the kind of security threats from, say, Baluch groups or things like that. I mean, they are obviously seen as a concern in specific parts of the country, but I talked in some depth about the kind of security hierarchy of concerns and things on the Chinese side. I'm not sure that the question, which always comes up in the background around these things about India supporting attacks, and Rabia mentioned it in her statements, I still don't get that as the primary kind of even security concern on China's part. It doesn't mean that there's nothing present at all there, but I don't think that's the kind of most salient question. And this is going to come up again when we talk about the US issue, which I think is also important in this. And I saw the question from Tariq Fatemi about that, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. But I think this is as much about the narrative around CPEC, and this is one of the other reasons why it's so sensitive, because this is all charged with questions of success and failure and all of the other things that it's loaded up with, rather than I think there being any sort of concerted attempt to actively stop projects or anything, or that's a particular concern on China's part. But certainly India's reaction has played into the way that China has thought about CPEC at different times, and certainly the current dynamics play into some of the choices, even around projects, I think, right now.
Thank you. Another group of questions that one question reflects are questions about the goals of CPEC and the Belt and Road Initiative as being originally justified as linking China with Europe, but then it seems that CPEC connects with Africa, the Middle East, or Iran and Afghanistan, and what is really going on in terms of the Belt and Road, and especially the CPEC connection, given that China may have multiple interests and CPEC is sort of just one that relates specifically to Pakistan.
I'll say a brief thing, and then I think others may want to comment on this. I think the physical connectivity elements of CPEC remain sort of somewhat overemphasized in the scheme of what CPEC is actually about. I think this tends to be, this has kind of always been stressed in the public imagination around CPEC and things. I think when you then look at the substance of what it is, there's a lot of internal connectivity in Pakistan. The cross-border elements, I still think, with the exception of fiber optics, and yes, there are some road upgrades and things, the capacity to connect through from Xinjiang to the coast is very difficult, just for reasons of topography, and so I don't think that's going away. I think the question of the connectivity issue for Pakistan is partly a Pakistan-India question. I think the connectivity basis for CPEC physically would look very different, and some of the CPEC long-term plans, it didn't appear in the final draft, but there were certainly versions and kind of analysis and assessments that one of the things that would make the most fundamental difference to CPEC as a sort of source of physical connectivity would obviously be if you were able to open up trade linkages between Pakistan and India. That would be the single most important thing that could kind of rebalance what that looked like, even including the kind of Xinjiang connection. Afghanistan, of course, and the Central Asia connection is potentially there in certain scenarios, but all the obstacles there remain. And so I still wouldn't put so much emphasis on the kind of China-Pakistan physical connections. I mean, it doesn't mean the ports won't be used. Ports can be used. The Gwadar even can be used for transshipment, and there'll be a special economic zone there and things like that. I still think the kind of interior connections and things, even again, the people who are doing the planning on this, I think there are still significant limitations to what's expected there, which is not necessarily true of a lot of other physical corridors and things elsewhere on the Belt and Road. And I'm sure John may have some comments on.
Yeah, I think some skepticism is always warranted when we see these maps of Belt and Road corridors. Sometimes Chinese officials say that there are 6 corridors. Most of them are not defined below the level of countries. So typically an economic corridor, you could say which cities are involved and which specific roads and rail projects and so on. The degree of detail just like it has not been there, and so I think it's been this convenient framework to give the appearance of some structure to a lot of activities that have frankly been more scattered, more opportunistic. I haven't seen a lot of evidence that China is really directing seriously effort into developing detailed corridors. It's much more scattered. There are examples of China to Europe rail services that are improved, and the only sort of physical connection that I can think of between, and it's not technically a CPEC project, but it does or would connect to Gwadar, is a submarine cable that'll go from Gwadar to Djibouti down the east coast of Africa, and then also over to France. So that, there are a few concrete things to point to, but just as the word corridor doesn't really describe CPEC, which is I think energy is the most important part of it. I think we should bring some skepticism to the others as well.
Thank you. I did want to get to the question that we got from Tariq Fatemi about the position of the United States, and I'll just read his question in its entirety. It's not that long. You're aware of Pakistan's desperate need for massive foreign investment in key sectors of its economy. How then can one understand the United States' strong and vocal opposition to Pakistan's participation in CPEC projects without offering anything even remotely close to the scale and kind of assistance China's been providing to Pakistan for large-scale projects ever since the two countries signed the CPEC-related agreements in 2015?
So let me make a couple of points on this. So, of course, if people don't know, Tariq Fatemi was in a position to know whether this was the case or not, and was very closely involved in all of this and the initial stages and much of CPEC. I think, however, that the kind of critical position taken by the United States has been more recent, rather than having been there throughout from the very beginning. Having seen US officials and discussed CPEC at very regular intervals before, during, after, at every single point, I think the initial view was kind of, the US prior to CPEC had been actively encouraging China to take on additional economic responsibilities and role in Pakistan, even more so in Afghanistan. But you have the point in which Richard Holbrooke is meeting, I think, Yang Jiechi, and says that the single biggest thing that China could do to help in Afghanistan or Pakistan would be to make more serious economic commitments in Pakistan. And I'm paraphrasing there. So the backdrop going into this was that for reasons, particularly when the security situation in Pakistan was much worse than it is today, I think there was a view that said that China kind of taking on a role that in some respects were still going to be, the US was still going to be limited in what it could do, both on the congressional end and just in terms of the sheer scale of what might be attempted, particularly in these kinds of investments, and that if China stepped in, this might be helpful. And I think that really did color the the approach to CPEC in the early stages, which was kind of skeptical about how China was going about it, and all the kind of obvious objections and concerns and things were there. But I think there was a sort of a degree of goodwill actually around the whole thing. I mean, it couldn't necessarily be expressed quite as publicly, particularly given the reaction that there would have been from the Indian side. But privately, I think it was a relatively supportive, or at very least neutral backdrop on how CPEC was seen. I think that's changed as a result of the wider kind of competition over the Belt and Road, free and open Indo-Pacific, and the dynamics in the US-China relationship. And it plays out as well in the relationship between the United States and China in South Asia more broadly. But CPEC, I mean, I won't touch on that as much. CPEC specifically, because it has this elevated status, because it has this kind of symbolically important status for the Belt and Road as a whole, was always going to end up being stuck in this kind of narrative battle. It was always going to be, it was going to be very hard to mount a kind of wider critique about the Belt and Road in the way that the United States has been doing, without also pointing to the flagship and analyzing that from in a way that is critical in ways that are, you know, in some of the critique, elements of the critique, I think have not necessarily been entirely fair. A number of them have not just been fair, but the same kind of critique that comes from many Pakistani interlocutors on CPEC as well. I don't think, as I say in the report, that it was necessarily such a good idea to go ahead with this kind of. It was never going to land well for precisely the reasons that Tariq Fatemi lays out, in a period in which, of course, the US has until recently been kind of tapering back financial and economic support, and there wasn't a sort of credible new package that Alice Wells, when she made her kind of speech, was able to lay out as kind of counterpoint to this. I think, of course, the questions around debt also played into things, particularly when the IMF negotiations were in play, and you saw the very kind of peculiar language that came out on the IMF deal that was essentially around not having the US bail out Chinese financiers or Chinese lenders. And so that was kind of there in the background, and it was Secretary Pompeo who kind of first started raising these critiques. But I don't think it's necessarily primarily characterized by kind of dead set opposition to CPEC and everything that's being attempted there, or that was kind of how it was seen. I think it's still viewed kind of critically, skeptically, and it does matter, of course, in this wider narrative battle. But I don't think a lot of the CPEC projects are necessarily seen in the same kind of light as you have seen certain other projects that really are viewed with much greater concern on the US side. I don't think there's been a fundamental reassessment from at least the South Asia people on the US side of you know, what the utility or otherwise of CPEC might look like. There's been more skepticism about it that's grown as they've seen the projects actually play out in practice as well there.
And combining a couple of questions that deal with environmental issues. One asks about the energy projects in Pakistan that were pretty good for the Chinese companies, but what about the delivery of electricity to Pakistani public? Was there substantial improvement for energy for households and industry? And related to that, the question about dam projects and their possible environmental effects, good or bad?
Let me just comment on the energy one. I haven't actually looked in enough depth at the environmental impact of the two dam projects, which are relatively new, but others might have be in a better position to comment on that. On the energy question, the deals were good for the Chinese companies in the first instance. The rates were pretty good. The rates were offered to everyone. It wasn't just the Chinese that were offered reasonable rates on the electricity pricing. They haven't actually been quite as good in practice. The report quotes one of the heads of the power companies, the power joint ventures, where they've taken a dual hit from both the actual shortfall of the payments and the fall in the value of the rupee. I think it's actually been quite difficult for some of the Chinese companies on the big completed projects in terms of the returns. The Pakistani government was supposed to that there'd been negotiations about having a fund put in place that would kind of make the Chinese companies whole. It was never created in the end. So I think it has actually, some of the energy projects have been more painful for Chinese companies. There is direct political lobbying on from the Chinese ambassador and others and has been at different points to get that addressed, that issue, unless it's been resolved very recently, as far as I'm aware, still hasn't gone away. I think the main thing, and we've just seen the renegotiations of a lot of the IPPs, at least the local independent power producers. The latest on the CPEC projects was that there was some suggestion that they may be willing to also make sort of similar concessions to of the sort that were made by the local producers, but that's unresolved yet. So I mean, there was kind of a big push on the overpricing question, whether they were really overpriced or not. One can debate, but I mean, this has been one of the kind of biggest processes of renegotiation on existing projects rather than on the overall debt situation. I think generally speaking, of course, there was a capacity increase. There was a significant capacity increase as a result of a lot of the CPEC projects. And they were completed extremely quickly. I mean, they were the pace. One of the intentions behind the projects was to be able to add capacity as quickly as possible, which was also one of the reasons that coal-fired power stations went ahead rather than some of the greener projects that would have taken longer to add capacity to the grid. These were things that could be put in motion at real pace, and capacity was added to the grid, but none of the issues in the energy sector, the fundamental issues, were addressed at the same time. But I mean, there wasn't an attempt to do that then, even if there are some steps going ahead on that.
And a question for Andrew, Rabia, and John, any or all of you who care to answer, about the quality of governance and transparency of the CPEC, especially given the inevitable risk of corruption where big bucks are changing hands.
Maybe someone else can start.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, as someone who has spent a lot of time trying to track down information on Chinese funded projects in various places, in some cases there is, the information is more readily available. I think that's mainly come from the Pakistani side, and in terms of setting up public resources to have information about projects. There have also been occasional statements from the Chinese embassy in Pakistan with some details. But I think just the fact that people couldn't agree on what the number was for this, I think suggests that, yeah, transparency has been lacking. That's really, I think that's been by design along the Belt and Road. I think, China's way of lending has been opaque by design, and certainly a lot more that they could do to increase transparency if they were committed to doing that.
So, I mean, I'll just to add kind of 1 or 2 points on this. It was very non-transparent at the beginning, in particular, partly because also there was so much going on simultaneously that no one had a total overview of everything that was happening. Was the level of the kind of flurry of activities that was going on was kind of extraordinary in the first couple of years, and I think there was just also a kind of I mean, we know in most of these instances that on the Chinese side there is a preference to keep these things kind of closely held, but even in the Pakistani system at points there were people who struggled. I mean, I quote the governor of the central bank, of course, in his famous kind of statement that he didn't know what any of the financial implications of the thing were in the early stages. It got better. I think that's certainly the case. You can assemble a lot of the material on the energy projects and things from publicly available websites. I've found, actually, as I mentioned, the Chinese numbers that have been released by the embassy in particular have tended to tally quite accurately with a lot of what's been going ahead. it's not invariably the case on many other issues at the moment, but the Chinese embassy in Islamabad was a pretty good source of information on the state of play with a lot of the projects. The most opacity, I mean, there are areas of kind of high opacity that have remained and remain there now, but there is also quite a lot more data than certainly than was there at the beginning. The corruption issue is a difficult one, which I won't attempt to kind of pronounce on. I do think the new government the PTI came into power assuming there would be a lot more corruption that could be dug out on the projects than proved to be the case. There were people kind of hauled in for questioning and things in that initial stage. I'm not going to tell you exactly the corruption that I think was playing out on it, but my sense is still that you didn't have the kind of, East Coast Railway line, 1 MDB. I mean, there are variants of the kind of massively plussed up project costs and significant payoffs and things like that. It may well be that I and others have missed something, but I still didn't see it playing out quite like that with CPEC. The army was suspicious about some of these things going on as well. They didn't have clear visibility on some of the payments and things that were taking place. That was one of their sources of concern as well at certain stages. But my sense on this was still that it was a certain level rather than the kind of debilitating levels that you've seen in some of the other BRI cases.
And a question that's come for Dr. Akhtar about the relationship between China and India that was mentioned, and whether or not there's any possibility that, given the experience of Pakistan with China and CPEC, that there might be an opening for Pakistan-India relations to improve.
I think, Pakistan and Indian relations have a dynamic of their own. And, that is irrespective of China-Pakistan relations. So I think they need to be looked at, they need to be decoupled, and they need to be looked at differently. Pakistan and India, have continued to have hostile relations. There's breakdown in dialogue. And I don't think that China, is in a position or has even offered to, provide an opening for talks between the two. Instead of that, since, late April, early May, you continue to see the standoff between India and China and continuous talk in Indian media about the two-front war scenario. So I don't foresee in near future Pakistan-India dialogue resuming, whether it's to talk about CPEC and an opening for India in it, until and unless, curfew is lifted in Kashmir that has been in place since August 5th, and the brutal, human rights violations that are happening there. I think that's Pakistan's priority at this point in time. So I don't see resumption of talks between the two countries on any subject, let alone CPEC. Thank you.
And then one last question, and I apologize that I won't be able to get to every question that we had received. For any of the speakers, are businesses and workers from Pakistan getting their fair share of CPEC projects? And are these going more to Chinese firms or firms from third countries?
So this has been kind of one of the points of contention, of course, with CPEC. Not necessarily just Pakistani businesses have been quite. There've been sections of Pakistani business that have been quite skeptical about CPEC, and there are some that have kind of seen it as beneficial. clearly this was then the main game in town at a certain point, and it changed the balance of kind of, you know, who was the in-group and who was the out-group in certain respects in terms of the access to a lot of what was going on around these sorts of projects. There were groups that saw themselves clearly as beneficiaries. You know, you can break it down regionally and things. You've got very different reactions in, let's say, Karachi versus Lahore, to put it that way, during the kind of early stages of the thing in particular. The problem, and this is why the industrial cooperation is an issue. So I mean, the Pakistani businesses were really burned by the FTA. I think a lot of them took a hit on that. So this is why you had a lot of the concerns about the special economic zones. They thought there were going to be a lot of privileges extended to the Chinese companies, that were going to work to their disadvantage. Even if they were allowed to go into the special economic zones at all, it would still be a kind of uprooting process. And there was, of course, this point and rumor that it was going to be for Chinese firms only. So you've had lots of kind of disquiet about that. You had lots of disquiet around the question just of, you know, the more sort of imaginary things about, you know, where the routes would go and the expectations that some would benefit more if it was here rather than there, and things like that, which I think did largely die down. I think the problem is it hasn't actually been such a big job generator. There are, one can kind of look at the assessments of these things. The understanding, I think, from the two sides was phase one was not going to be the big job generator, that a lot of these big infrastructure projects, you were going to get essentially laborer jobs for the roads and things like that. If you look at the larger numbers for job generation and things for CPEC, a lot of them are basically laborers on the roads in terms of jobs generated on the Pakistani side. A lot of these other projects were not going to be so significant on that in that regard. It was going to be when you started to move into the second phase, industrial cooperation and these sorts of things, that you started getting the higher job projections and things around it. So that is also one of the reasons why there's been such concern that we haven't moved beyond the kind of heavy infrastructure phase on a really serious scale yet. That you haven't kind of got you haven't got into the phase where you are generating these sorts of returns and you are able to kind of point to numbers showing those sorts of economic benefits for local workers, again beyond some of, you know, these road building projects and things. So I think that's still one of the things that's kind of been hanging over CPEC. If you had a really good story to sell on that, then it would look different. They knew they weren't going to get that story yet, and I still don't think they quite have that story to tell now.
Let me just ask if Rabia or John have any last word, and then I regret that we have to bring this to a close because we're already past time.
I'm good, James. I think Andrew has, you know, written a great report. I'm sure a lot of effort has gone into it. I would like it to be received well in Pakistan as well. So let's see, you know, what reactions come your way, Andrew, and look forward to reading more from you. And thank you so much for so comprehensively answering all the questions, because that's been a great learning experience for me as well. Thank you so much.
Likewise, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. Congratulations again to Andrew on the report, and really encourage everyone who's been watching and asking questions to read that. I do think it does stand out in the approach and in all of the ground that's covered.
Well, my thanks to all of you, Andrew, especially for all the hard work that was put in on the report, and also to Tom Kellogg for his assistance in producing that, and also getting this event together, and to Melissa Ladner, who's been working behind the scenes to make everything work in terms of the tech, and Alberto Taglia. I just want to mention that the report is available now online, and I hope everyone will read it. And I know that John Hillman has a forthcoming book as well, and I'm sure that that's going to be an interesting read for people who are concerned about these issues. So with thanks to everyone for your participation, we have to say goodbye.